what does good look like or great look like from a reporting perspective? And then we'll work back as to how we do that.
I was struggling with the idea of how do we come together and build effective teams when we don't limit ourselves by hiring geographically.
Welcome back to the Raw Selection Private Equity Podcast. On the podcast today is Joe Gerber, a proven operator and operating partners working with private equity and PE-backed companies. We are going to deep dive today into data, how to find the right data modules, how to go from good to great on data, and the mistakes that both private equity firms and portfolio executives are making. And to couple with that, all about excellence with regards to data and his examples of projects that he's worked on that you can replicate too. Joe, if you can share with us a brief insight into you, please.
Happy to. I've spent the first 12 years of my career in middle market investment banking, doing buy-side, sell-side work, mostly for equity groups. And then the 20 years since stepping into plateaued middle market companies, mostly engineering or science-based companies, and transforming them, accelerating growth, and helping them exit, and some for equity groups. And then finally doing a bunch of work as operating advisor for a number of equity groups on the specific portfolio companies they have.
Perfect. What's one mistake that you see private equity firms or portfolio companies making, and what would you suggest to correct it?
Well, in all my work with different equity groups, the common theme is typically that they hit the ground running either with the existing management team or they bring in a new management team, and they're often running with existing reporting. And when I'm brought in, I see that reporting is typically delayed or not sufficient for really accountability and catching issues early.
So what are you doing differently? What are the actual guys missing? Well, let's start with this. What does good look like or great look like from a reporting perspective? And then we'll work back as to how we do that.
Sure. So I'll give you an example. I stepped into a situation where there was a 20 location business service, medical service company, and they were looking to bring in a CFO. And when I looked at it, I said, look, your reporting from the time that you hit go is about 30 to 45 days. I said, that really needs to be real time. You really need to know where you are on a daily basis. And they said, well, how do you do that? And I said, well, if you create a database and then you pull SQL queries from all the different locations and pull the data in that you need. And then what you do is most companies can forecast not only on sort of a financial basis, but on a metric basis. And so many units out, so many units in, and so forth. And if you marry that on a daily basis by backing into it, it gives you really, really good insights as to what's happening on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And it gives the management team at a high level comfort things are on track. And when things are not, they can dive in and find out where they're not on track, and they can pay attention much faster.
Okay. So what are some of the metrics that you typically look at that go, this is typically missed? And equally, what are some of the metrics that are usually too lagging and need some kind of attention to bring to, if you want to call it real time or as close?
Sure. So for instance, in medical service business that I was working with, it was MRIs. And MRIs, CAT scans, and ultrasounds. So if the centers could only process so many per day and each scan was effectively the same cost or price, you could then forecast what the center should be doing, but then back into what that looks like on a monthly, weekly, daily basis. And then so when the information was put into the system at each center, you could match on a daily basis whether it fit the metrics that you set. On a manufacturing basis, if you're manufacturing widgets, and even if 10 widgets or 100 widgets, it doesn't necessarily matter. You can forecast not only the dollars, but the units. And knowing the revenue per unit and estimated cost per unit, whether it's labor or materials, you can then back into metrics on a monthly, weekly, daily basis, where using, for instance, RFID, you sort of know where everything is. And in that sense, you can then marry actual versus projected. And if you roll that up to a dashboard and give the management team what they need at a high level, right? You don't need to feed them the details, but at a high level, is it on track or off track? If it's off track, then they can drill down. And it allows the management team to focus on what they're good at and what they're supposed to be focused on, which is growing and expanding the business.
Okay, so giving them the data to be able to make educated decisions. What examples of data have you produced with businesses and you've gone in and worked on that have changed the direction around, actually, this is no longer our major constraint, we need to make some changes here? What kind of pivots have you seen because of having real-time data?
Yeah, so this MRI center example I gave you is perfect, because when I came in, the equity group couldn't give me a P&L on each center. So I scratched my head. I thought that was really interesting, right? So the way the data was coming in was that all the centers were rolling in their data on a monthly basis, and the accountants were going together. So I created a model with an analyst to do exactly what I just explained. And what I learned, because it's a metric business, is that they were throwing people at problems. And this happens a lot in manufacturing, especially in aerospace, right? So when you look at a center and you say, okay, there's so many patients per day. How long does it take to onboard a patient? How long does it take to process a patient? And you time all that, and you realize that it really takes X number of people to process the customers per day. And why do you have, 2 times that or 3 times that, right? So you start asking questions. What we found in that situation is that we could eliminate a third of the headcount. And by doing so, we grew EBITDA by 30%. And the business continued to grow because everybody was then focused. In that situation, I was a bit creative, and I said, hey, we're in the service business, so let's force rank everybody by caring, how much they cared, instead of what their positions were, because they kept hiring people based on a resume, and a lot of those people weren't the right people for the front desk or for the back office. And so we restructured the people and ended up growing the heck out of it and selling it. So it was a great success. And for me, it was a really fun project, because data really does highlight what's working and what's not working. In other cases, you can see balance sheet items where there's pilferage, for instance, of aluminum or of medicines. Because if you know what your consumption is and you forecast your consumption, you can see very easily where you're off track, right? And you can do that effectively, and when you take the case of rapidly growing revenue, the danger of rapidly growing revenue is that cash has to be optimized, and you optimize cash by optimizing working capital, the currents of both assets and liabilities. And when you do that and you create a forecast and you're watching actual against forecast, what you can do is you can highlight now when you're off track in your optimization of your burn rate. And so if you're growing a bit faster than your working capital allows, you know it much sooner. Or if you're growing slower than your working capital might permit, the management can see, what can we do? Right? So that visibility has allowed me in the past to tune growth.
To protect investors from bad hires for your portfolio company, I've collated into a brand new book some of the top tips and processes investors use to ensure they do not hire those bad hires into their portfolio companies. We are giving the book for free for the first 100 people that join the waiting list, so please check out the show notes and get your name down for a free copy. So I think most private equity firms would say that they are good with data. I think when you got into the detail of it, it may be questionable, and they'd obviously like more. If we focus around something actionable for somebody who's going, right, I'm listening to this, we're pretty good with data, Joe, we've got this handled. What's one thing that would take it from good to great that you see that most private equity firms either are doing, but they're not doing enough of, or they're not getting it timely? What if I was managing partner of Raw, private equity, terrible name again, like Raw Selection, but that was the case, right? And I was like, right, I'm going to look at my 5, 10, 15 portfolio companies, and I want to make one improvement on data that will help me drive decision-making. I think it's good. How do I make it great? It's going to be different for each business on the premise, but what one thing that you think, if they just took a look at this and just got it more timely, if they just got better data around it, this would make a huge difference? Now, that might be too much of a simplistic question, but do your best to answer that if you can, Joe.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind and that I've seen a number of times is that, the equity group makes a bet on the management team, on the CEO, right, the COO, and they're off and running. And in one respect, let's say they don't have the data, right? In another respect, they do. They don't necessarily need the detailed data. The management team needs some detailed data, but them being off track can be not only identified earlier, but coached, right? Because what the equity group really doesn't want is to get to year 2 and realize they've got to swap out the management team, right? And so, but the challenge I found for the equity groups is they don't want to be extra cooks in the kitchen, right? They don't want to be in there pointing fingers and second guessing. So how do you necessarily manage that? Well, to the extent that there's high level on track, off track reporting that comes out of the data that the management sees and the equity group has access to, then the management team has what they need to micro-correct, to optimize growth, to do all the things that they need to do. And then now the equity group can look at the management team as they proceed over the first year and say, are they getting it? Are they on track with what we expect from this management team, right? And so if it's not the case, then they're identifying that issue much earlier in the process where they made a bet. Let's say they made the wrong bet. They can make that change in year 1, right? Because they have a team instead of reporting quarterly, right? And what are we going to do better next time? And now they're into the second and the third quarter, and now, right? So now it's like, okay, how is the management team responding to off track, whatever that looks like? And I think it's a way for them to understand whether their CEO, and I've not only coached CEOs, I've been hired to hire CEOs, and I sort of group CEOs into sort of 3 buckets, right? For sales, they're a sales CEO, they're an engineering type CEO, or they're a financial type CEO. And each one has strengths, but each one has weaknesses, right? And if they play to their strengths, the sales CEO may be trying to grow the heck out of the company, but at the same time, what if they're not optimizing working capital, right? In one direction or another. That can be seen a lot sooner with a lot more data points. The engineering CEO, in what they're doing and what they're focused on through all the data, right? The equity group can drill down if they need to, but at the same time, it's a tool for each one of these CEOs to have better information about what they're not as familiar with.
Makes sense. So if you're going into a business, let's say you referenced a widget manufacturing company, which is just classic for simplicity, and I like it. What would you do if you went into that said manufacturing company? It's private equity backed. They've got some data already, obviously, because it's P backed. What are the places you go looking in the most part for the data that gives you the information, as opposed to gives you the information that tells you where to go next, where to drill deeper? What are the cornerstones of data that you look for to drive decision making on where you go next? Because I'm sure you could get data on hundreds of different touch points. Where do you start?
Yeah, so today I think I start with the system. So meaning that regardless of what accounting system the company is using, and it depends on how many locations, right? Because you start having multiple locations, and that's typically, it presents a difficulty for the management team. And so how do you pull together at a high level the financial information, and then now begin to forecast in a much more detailed way the components of first working capital? So on a top down, you're forecasting the P&L, right? But the components of cost of goods has to come out of the balance sheet. And that's all about where things are, either in supply chain or in inventory or in process. And today with RFID, that's easy. And so as a CEO of a multi-location manufacturing situation, you now are able to, on a daily basis, know where everything is. And with barcode, you know how many hours are into each one of your parts as there's a buildup. And so you can roll all that information up into a forecast that's been built top down, so that on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, you know where you should be. And all you're looking for, or all I'm looking for, is on track or off track. If there's a delta to expected, how big is it? And is it growing or is it not growing? And the data analytics can provide that. So I don't spend much time in the details. I spend a lot of time looking at the dashboard and one level below the dashboard and say, okay, are we on track in all the areas? And then as a CEO, I can spend time where I need to spend time on initiatives, right?
Not only am I the host of the Private Equity Podcast, but I'm also the founder and managing partner of Raw Selection. Raw Selection is a private equity specialist executive search firm with two divisions, one that focuses on portfolio, C-suite executive hires, and one that focuses on private equity direct hires via back office and investment deal professionals, operating across Europe and North America. A unique offering of our service is that we offer a full money-back guarantee on all upfront deposits. We typically take around $10,000 as an upfront deposit to commence a search process. The remainder is then on completion, but that upfront deposit is completely refundable. If you're not happy with our service, we'll refund that upfront deposit, no questions asked. With your coaching of portfolio chief execs, or just chief execs in general, what's the message that you find yourself consistently saying that you wish you didn't have to say anymore because every CEO is already doing it?
So I notice when I sit with CEOs is that they talk about their strengths, going back to those three types, and they begin to not cover up, but provide excuses or deflections to their weaknesses. And that's a human quality, like people do that, right? So the question is, how do you take a CEO in one respect, let's say they're an engineering or sales-based CEO, and get them to become comfortable with the power of information and get them to understand that if they spend some time and understood what they could glean from that information, it would allow them to play to their strength much, much more. And then you take the financial type, which is a bit different, who may gravitate to this, right? But the problem there is you don't want that. because you want that CEO to step out of their financial world and to really play towards their growth mindset, to improvements, to initiatives. So it's almost backward coaching that CEO.
Perfect. What are your influences, Joe? What do you read? What do you watch? What do you listen to outside of head in data?
Yeah, so I read a lot of different things. The most recent thing I read, and it came as a recommendation from somebody, The Art of Gathering. And it was by Parker. Really, really interesting book. I sort of moved towards it, I think, because at the time I was helping the company build a virtual predictive analytics company. And I was struggling with the idea of how do we come together and build effective teams when we don't limit ourselves by hiring geographically. And so the book presents ideas personally creating gatherings like a dinner party, and professionally creating gatherings in a way that's purposeful, that provides insights as to how to really bring groups together so that they're connected and that they contribute regardless of where they are or how they come together. It was, for me, quite a fascinating book. I also sort of do a lot of work on myself. I'm a super curious person. So, I also just finished out with Peter Attia. I'm a super process person. So I love his idea of, if you think about the last decade of your life and what do you not want to be able to do with your grandkids or with the people around you? And so what can you do today to make sure that in the last decade of your life, you can carry on up an escalator that's not working at an airport, right? Or things like that. So for me, I find inspiration in a lot of different places. And on a daily basis, I read the McKinsey insights, the Bain insights. I find great little nuggets there.
How does anybody reach out to you, Joe? How best do they get in touch, please?
LinkedIn would be great. That's usually the best way. I'm on that every day and happy to connect with people.
One of my favorite places as well, being a recruiter. Well, yes. Joe, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast, sharing your insights into data, one of private equity's favorite topics. Some would call it dull, but everybody in everything in business needs data, needs to be able to run through metrics and understand that to drive their business to success. And nobody knows that better than private equity and hopefully their portfolio executives. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
And thank you for everybody tuning in yet again to the Private Equity Podcast. It comes out every week, so please do ensure that you have subscribed. But till the next time, keep smashing it, and thank you very much for listening.